We're here with Dr. Rupert Faulkner, Senior Curator in the Japanese section of the Asian Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum, who's recently received the Order of the Rising Sun Gold and Silver Rays from the Japanese government. Good afternoon, Dr. Faulkner.
Hi there, hello. Well, I have to say it's a huge honour to have been awarded such a prestigious naming by the Japanese government. I'm really very, very happy. Yes.
Yes, and very well deserved. And we're looking forward to speaking a little bit about your career and some of the achievements that you've made as you got along. So let's get started. Dr. Faulkner, do you mind just introducing yourself briefly and letting us know, where it all began, I suppose, the connection to Japan and so on?
Well, yes, I mean, I've actually joined the V&A in 1984, so just over 36 years ago. I had studied Japanese at Cambridge as an undergraduate, and I did my doctorate, which was a focus on Japanese ceramic history at Oxford. And I was in, it was actually while I was in Japan on a grant that I first got to meet people from the V&A. I have to say, I mean, it was all rather kind of fortuitous because it turned out that the head of what was called the Far Eastern Department at that time, somebody called John Ayres, I met him at a conference in Hong Kong, and not long after that, he wrote to me to say that, well, he was due to retire, and that the staff in the V&A would there'd be a gradual shuffling up, and there might well be a post advertised, and why don't you try? Why don't you apply? I mean, this was before there was kind of news whizzing around the world. I mean, basically it was sort of letter and fax, I suppose, if you had a fax machine. So it was all terribly slow. But anyway, the job did come up, and I did apply, and I was successful. I was actually in Japan at the time. And I mean, that was sort of the beginning of it. Yes.
And what a remarkable period to have been working at the V&A. You oversaw some really substantial changes in both how the Japanese section is organized and catalogued, but also indeed how it's presented, isn't it?
That's right. Yes. I mean, when I joined, the new head of the department, somebody called Joe Earle, who is a consultant for Bonhams now in London. But yes, he had sort of persuaded the then director at the V&A, Sir Roy Strong, that the gallery in which temporary exhibitions were held should actually become a full-scale Japanese gallery, because we were really not presenting Japan in as full a light as we really should be doing. And actually that had been sort of agreed when I joined, but the funding hadn't been agreed. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of, so, I mean, this is before corporate social responsibility of the kind that's funded, all sorts of projects in the last 30 odd years or so. But the Toshiba Corporation came on board thanks to the then ambassador, Yamazaki, persuading Toshiba that this would be a good thing to do. So I arrived there in, like I said, 84, and the gallery opened at the end of 86. And it was really the first of two new galleries that opened at the V&A for really since the 1950s, something like that. Wow. And so it did give us a chance to present Japan as properly as we could. So it actually was rather, you're quite right. I mean, it was a kind of amazing period, really.
Yeah, and it's this huge revolutionary step and quite bold, actually, by the V&A to dedicate, such a substantial amount of space to one area. And, considering the size of the Japanese collection, just talk us through, the process of selecting the pieces that in the end were going to be displayed.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it did involve going through kind of all the collections. I mean, Joel, myself, and then we had two Chinese specialists who kind of knowledge about certain areas of Japan as well. So kind of between us, these lists got honed down until we had well, we didn't actually, I mean, nowadays if you do a gallery, you would be 100% selection would be made before any design started.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the Japanese gallery, the themes had been set and candidate object lists were made. And it wasn't actually until the gallery had been installed that we worked out exactly the placement, what was going to go there. But it wasn't a gallery that was built around objects in the way that often nowadays happens quite often. And in fact, the design, which continues up to the present day, is kind of modular. Mm. There are very few kind of partitions between sections. So it does give you a flexibility to kind of change things around, and at the beginning to kind of experiment with different arrangements of objects. And that flexibility has been a great strength of the gallery, because you can, which we've often done over the years, is actually strip out one section and put in a temporary display of something, and then you can do the same thing in different parts of the gallery. And in that respect, I think it has been the most flexible, and still it remains the most flexible of all the galleries in the museum. Oh. And of course, you're quite right. I mean, we had what there was on display of Japan was relatively small before. You know, part of it was around the Chinese gallery. There was very much in the post-war arrangement. You had China at the center, and then you had Korea and Japan as kind of satellite cultures, which was quite an interesting arrangement.
Reflective of the time, I suppose.
Well, yes. I mean, that was sort of cooked up in the 50s, I suppose, really 50, yeah, something like that. And there was another narrow space actually that came on board in about 1980, so it only existed for 4 years. But to have had 400 square meters in that run of ground floor galleries was kind of remarkable, really. So Joel did a very good job in persuading Roy Strong that, you know, this was what needed to be done. Yeah, and we benefited from it, and it won't change, I don't think. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
and, you know, and it is just such a fantastic home for, you know, sort of beacon of Japanese culture. And one thing I find very interesting is, you know, these days when you walk in there, perhaps what you might expect to see is not necessarily what you see, especially when you talk about sort of manufactured objects and, you know, more contemporary pop culture type objects that are almost juxtaposed with the other, you know, objects. So one thing I found interesting when I was reading in advance of this was, you know, the idea is to include these things. So, you know, what sort of role do you see for these, you know, these sort of pop culture type things in the sort of Japanese story?
In the Japanese story, well, yeah, I mean, that configuration, I mean, the configuration that we have now, I mean, it uses, is a configuration that was put into place in November 2015. So thanks to the Toshiba Corporation extending their naming of the gallery for another 10 years from 2011, that's right, we were able to do an upgrade of the gallery. And we did a certain amount of interviewing of the public, staff, of colleagues, etc., you know, to see what people thought would be a good idea to include. And I mean, in all cases, you know, more on the contemporary was the message. In the old manifestation of the gallery, we had a section devoted to studio crafts, which we had just begun to collect, but that really was that was a limit of it. But with this kind of feedback that we got, we decided to kind of broaden the scope. And so that's when we started including industrial or if you want to product design, this kind of thing. And I think, well, I think we were trying to show that kind of aspect, the sort of creativity in all these other areas, and sort of, you know, to bring things up to date. But I also felt we were keying into really what, in fact, most people, if you say Japan to them, will not be thinking of the post sort of pre 1950s Japan, really. They think of things that have happened since that period. So we were, I think we were sort of going with the times and trying to sort of be a place which would well, give recognition of that, and also sort of, but by giving a space in which to show such objects, which involved chopping the gallery up a bit. So giving something like 25% of the gallery space to the contemporary, it was also, well, I suppose this is a kind of way in which museums work. If you've got somewhere to show things, then there's more justification for buying things or collecting things, or persuading people to give you things. So that was also a kind of unwritten part of the agenda. I kind of led on that refurbishment, which from about 2013 took about two and a half years in the planning and delivering.
Yes, it's a huge undertaking and a huge revamp. And as you say, giving people that point of contact with Japanese culture is, you know, is kind of eases people in perhaps to things they might not be familiar with.
Yes.
And possibly there are other connections anyway, you know, like I understand one of your main research areas is ukiyo-e, woodblock prints. And, you know, and there was a time where these were ubiquitous objects, you know, they were not fine art, they were not, you know, this, or not all of them anyway. So, you know, just because we're used to mass-produced objects these days, you know, there is a sort of another connection there, which I think is interesting.
Yes.
You know, what was it about ukiyo in particular that sort of captured your imagination? And
well, ukiyo, yes. In fact, my background is more in ceramic history, but ukiyo, well, I was actually employed by Joel to do something about the ukiyo collection, and which I, sort of, as well as doing the gallery, that was sort of one of the things that was happening shortly after I joined. I did actually go all the way through the collection and looked at what had been written about the collection, and which is enormous. I mean, we sort of over 25,000 prints, but I got very interested in this small group of about 100 and something fan prints by Hiroshige. And fan prints are things that are kind of mounted up as fans and kind of used, you know, like in, you know, if you go to Japan in the summer, you see everybody's got fans, and both the folding type, but these are the kind of rigid type. And we have these designs, and clearly a lot of them have never been used, and those that had been used were still in very good condition, and they were kind of spectacular, really, in terms of their state of preservation, and the subject matter was quite varied. And I suppose that's one project that I sort of devoted quite a lot of time to in terms of the prints, as well as setting up a cataloguing system to deal with this big collection.
Yeah, and the research implications of that are obviously phenomenal, to have the accessibility of these objects. And, you know, and by highlighting these fans, you know, I think possibly most people who are familiar with woodblock prints might not necessarily immediately have an image of a fan in their mind.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people who know, but I mean, yes, you think of sort of prints in a kind of geometric, you know, sort of square or oblong format, and in groups of 3, groups of 5, that kind of thing. Yeah, no, fans aren't that well known, and it was very. I mean, and then of course they are, because they were used on the whole, they got destroyed. So they are a kind of a rather special form of ephemera, really, if one wants to put it down to that. But of course, it actually gives you a sense of objects in use, really, a fan, in a way that just a print on a wall might not. It's quite interesting, actually. One of the fan print collection had attention had been drawn to it by an early member of the V&A staff called Edward Strange, and he wrote a book. I mean, one of his specialities was prints, and he wrote a monograph about Hiroshige sort of in the early 20th century, and he devotes a chapter to this collection of fan prints. That was a thing that kind of sort of got me onto it. The other thing was actually, funny enough, a visit by the Friends of the Ukiyo Society in New York, who knew about the collection, and they came at one point to the V&A, and I showed them these prints, and they were wowed by them, because they really are wow objects. And they said, you know, you must do something about them. You must do something about them. Well, anyway, I did do something about them, which involved persuading our publications department that this was a good thing to do.
Yeah, something worth.
And so this little volume came out, which I got a lot of help with in Japan. I mean, but it was a great project, actually. But Strange, interesting, in the preface to, I don't know, it was in the preface to that Hiroshige. Well, no, it was a more general statement about our collection. But he said that the V&A has this very large collection of prints, which are not necessarily collected on a connoisseurial, as a kind of connoisseurial project, but they do reflect many aspects of life in Japan.
Right.
So he was taking almost an, if you want to go to sort of anthropological or ethnographic kind of not justification, but explanation of what the value of the collection was.
Right.
And I think that's still true. But of course, you know, they are fictions in many respects. On the other hand, there are truths in there as well, if I want to say that. And the other thing is they're very, very rich in information about the Kabuki theatre, because so many of the prints are to do with the Kabuki theatre. And so we've had various people, Kabuki scholars, look at it in order to, you know, so it's a treasure trove. Sorry,
And, you know, and even if they are fictions, you know, that the fact that it was fiction that was deemed worthy of representing in art is kind of indicative of what was going on in the society at the time. So it is quite, as you say, about this, you know, it's a sort of snapshot of the era, as well as a piece, you know, pieces that have artistic value in their own right. So it's a really fascinating project.
I was just to add to that. Of course, we've just had this exhibition at the V&A, which unfortunately, because of the COVID, has sort of stopped, and it stopped, and then started again, but it's now closing, the Kimono Exhibition, Curator's Catwalk. And I don't know whether you had a chance to visit that, but my colleagues who curated that were very creative in their use of woodblock prints that showed courtesans, life in the city, and the centrality of textiles or other sort of dress as a kind of, you know, as fashion, you know. So I
did manage to get down to that, luckily.
Oh, you did, yeah.
It was quite interesting to see how they played, you know, the physical kimono in front of you with that kimono's representation in the art, you know, because it's quite easy to see a woodblock print and assume that, you know, these were arbitrarily chosen fabrics that these people are wearing, but actually no, these were what you would genuinely see, you know, in the pleasure district and wherever else you were in Edo or wherever. It's really fascinating, actually. So, you know, I mean, that's so from one fascinating project to another. I just want to talk a little bit about the Mazarin Chest, if we can, because this was, you know, a phenomenal piece of conservation, and is obviously a phenomenal object. So, you know, why the chest in particular?
That particular chest. Well, I think we've recognized it for a long time as being, one of the great examples of Japanese lacquer made for export to Europe in the early 17th century. And we have other pieces of a similar quality, but not quite on that size. Certain amount had been published in Japan about the chest, and I think quite a long time ago it actually did travel to Japan. It was, some work was done on it before it went on display in the Toshiba Gallery when it first opened in 1986. It had been in a dark corridor next to the Chinese Gallery for the that I mentioned before. But what triggered that project that you're referring to, the Mazarin Chest project, was the fact that the Japanese government the Agency for Cultural Affairs, working with the Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties, well, basically it's a program for the conservation of Japanese treasures in overseas collections, which had been running for quite a number of years. At the beginning, it was mainly works on paper, swords that they were looking at. But there was a point in the late 90s, is that right, when they started looking at other kinds of decorative art, or looking at kinds of decorative art, sorry, of which lacquer was one of the focuses. And we were visited by a research team who would, every so often they would have a research team who would visit different institutions where they thought there might be interesting material to look at for possible conservation in Japan. So it was a program whereby the owning institution would send the item to be conserved in Japan. And a year or 2 years later, however long it take, it will be returned. And we were invited to send the Mazarin Chest to Japan for that purposes. We thought, well, I mean, that would be fantastic to have it consolidated, because we knew that it wasn't in as good conditions as we really would like to have it, you know. Mm-hmm. But we thought, well, the only thing about this is we're not going to, we'll get it conserved, and we'll have all the notes about how it was conserved, but we wouldn't really learn much about how to look after lacquer. Yeah. So our starting point was that, no, we don't want to send it to Japan. We're very much interested in the professional advice we could get from Japan, but we would rather have somebody come from Japan, a specialist conservator, and work with our team in order, one, obviously the outcome was to have the object put right, so to speak, but also we would learn through the process about how to look after lacquer and some of the techniques of, and that yes, I don't know why we were so ambitious, because it was exhausting.
Ambitious.
But anyway, it was about 2-3 years in the planning as to what we wanted to, what we wanted to do and what we needed. And it was then that we put in a big application to the Getty Foundation, and also received funding from the Toshiba International Foundation, who as part of the kind of, I mean, it's an independent entity within the Toshiba Corporation, who've supported us in various conservation projects prior to that. So with these two funders, we were able to invite a specialist conservator to come to London. It was so many months spread over 3 years, I think, to work with our staff. Particularly somebody called Shane Rivers, who used to be in our conservation department. So they worked together actually on the conservation process. We had conservation scientists helping advise on the use of well, I mean, I suppose that what do I call it? One of the big issues in conservation of lacquer is whether you do what the Japanese do, which is use the same materials as the objects originally made out of which the key thing is urushi lacquer. But having used urushi lacquer, you can never remove it. So this ideal of reversibility in conservation is a kind of, has been a sort of key requirement, I suppose, in Western conservation practice. So using lacquer is to do something irreversible. Sorry, using urushi is something irreversible. Using other materials are reversible. But there's always been this kind of not exactly battle is too strong a word, but I mean, and sometimes it
ideological difference, I suppose, isn't
it has got quite heated at times. As you know, should you, what should you or shouldn't you, kind of thing. And I think what we felt, we had a very good conservator from Japan, and he was open to using non-Japanese, non-traditional materials in certain cases. And we, with the research that was done and the experience of using urushi, realized that actually we're not too worried about reversibility. What really we should be worried about is retreatability.
Right.
And they sound like the same thing, but then they're not actually. They're radically different in the sense that you're not taking something away necessarily. You're able to to work again on the object using those same materials to consolidate it. And I mean, the key thing is not to change the appearance more than absolutely necessary, and as little as possible. So, well, it was a project that kind of mushroomed because we had we then had a link up with Imperial College across the road from the V&A, and we had 2, and in the end 3 PhDs running in parallel with the conservation project. It was feeding, so quite a lot has got published as a result of that. So there is now there has been quite a expanding English language literature about lacquer and the use of urushi as a conservation material. And the other thing was the art history side of things. Actually, that I keep talking. Is this all right?
Of course, it's absolutely fine. You know, there's no point me talking.
So you had the conservation, you had the science, you had the kind of, if you want to call it, the ethics so sort of kind of breaking new ground in terms of the kind of ethics of retreatability, reversibility. But the other thing was the, if you want to call it, the art historical background of this. And we knew, fun enough, Joel, the person I mentioned as having been the head of the department when I joined, had done a certain amount of work and published an important article in about 1983 on the Mazarin Chest and these other very high-level Japanese export lacquer objects. And we knew from that stage that there was there was another similar looking chest that had gone off the radar in about, well, it was in the 1940s, that it must exist somewhere. We also knew that there was a third, there must have been a third chest because we had another item that had been chopped up and incorporated into French furniture in the 18th, in fact, that furniture is 19th century, which was quite common. I mean, lacquer screens and things got when they came to Europe, they actually got cannibalized and incorporated into furniture. So we had bits of what had to be a third chest. So this all really happened between 2003 and 2010. Well, actually, the story doesn't quite finish there. But we had a Dutch scholar who was looking into she's done a lot of work on archives of the Dutch East India Company, which would have been the channel through which the Mazarin Chest and other things were brought to Europe. And we knew from documents that she came across that there were 4 chests. Okay. So we thought, okay, we've got one in this photograph that we haven't spotted. We've got ours. We've got the third one. We don't know what the 4th one is. My colleague Julia Hart, which is now retired, but who's our lacquer specialist, thought it might be such and such. But this such and such was not actually in the same shape as the 2 that as our one and the one in the photograph. And then some years, now you put me on the spot, or at least I put myself on the spot here. It wasn't that long ago. An auction house in France contacted Julia to say that we think we have found something very similar to your Mazarin Chest. And it transpired that it was the one that was in those photographs. Wow. Yes, which had been bought from a sale in Wales, where it had resided from the first half of the 20th century, and had been a business. The person who had bought it actually lived not so far away from the V&A for many, many years. So this chest had been sitting somewhere in SW, yes, in the near proximity. He then retired to France, or he sold it to somebody who then retired to France, and it turned up in the sort of central France. It was just in a family, and you know, when the owner died, I think this auction house was asked to deal with the proceeds, and there was no, that was it, you know. And it had apparently, I mean, I didn't see this, but it sort of had stains inside where it had been used for storing bottles of wine, and yeah, and I think, you know, there was television used to stand on it and all this kind of thing.
What an experience in life.
So that sold at a very high price, and it was bought by the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which couldn't be a more appropriate place, because of course that was a centre of, well, that's where the Dutch East India Company had their head offices. So, and it's now called, we used to call it Mazarin Chest 2 or something, but they now call it the Rijksmuseum Chest or the Amsterdam Chest.
Oh, right, okay.
So anyway, so that was, and then something else that happened a little earlier than that was that we were contacted by a restoration studio in Paris to say that the owner, she said, well, we've come across this panel in our kind of spare parts room, and I think it might be something to do with something like the Mazarin Chest because it has a cartouche on it. There is an interior designer in Texas, I think, who is actually quite keen to buy this because he wants to incorporate it into a coffee table. But we sort of think it might have more, you know, importance than that. So we went across to look at this thing, and it clearly was it was outside of the top of another chest.
Wow.
Yeah. So we were able to acquire that actually. So that added to our bits and pieces sort of collection. So we got another important part of that chest.
Yeah.
And then, I suppose the most not more extraordinary, but this was like a kind of a novella developing. I mean, it was quite extraordinary, really.
Yeah.
The State Hermitage, no, not the Hermitage Museum. Moscow State Museum of History were in touch with us, with our metalwork department, actually, to say, we've got this interesting object that has really very interesting metal fittings. Do you know anything? Would you be able to help? This is one of our colleagues. And they sent photographs. And Tessa Murdoch it was. She said, which immediately recognized it as similar to the Mazarin Chest and got in touch with us. And that was chest number 4.
Oh, wow.
So you can't believe it, you know. We have 1.5 photographs, and we've now actually got all 4 of them. Well, one of them still in bits, yeah. And it had been given to the museum at the beginning of the 20th century, full of furs, obviously by a sort of an aristocrat, and to the textile department. And nobody paid any attention to the chest, but they didn't throw it away, and it was put into a big box.
Wow.
And then they must have been going through trying to sort out their storage, and this big crate was uncrated, and they found this thing, and because it had these metal fittings, it was transferred to or shown to the metalwork department, or the department who looked after metalwork.
So the fittings that inspired the
yeah.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Have these four ever been shown together, or is it?
No, not yet.
Well, it hasn't quite gotten there.
Well, of course, at the moment it's impossible to think of doing anything as ambitious as that. But yes, I think one day it would be really good to do a Satogaidi, you know, returning to Japan, of all of these things.
Oh, goodness me.
Yeah, there was an exhibition in Amsterdam, which was called. Was actually the title of the exhibition called Asia in Amsterdam. So it was looking at the activities of the Dutch East Indian Company and this kind of thing. And they showed the chest that had been used for television, that one, television, and they managed to borrow the one from Moscow.
Oh, they did.
We weren't able to. That happened. We weren't able to send the Mazarin Chest because the exhibition coincided almost exactly with the reopening of the Toshiba Gallery in November 2015. So we couldn't lend it, although we lent something else, smaller but very important. I won't see it happen because I won't be at the V&A forever. In fact, only about 6 months more, but it could happen. Yeah,
it would be fantastic
to go there. It would be totally tremendous, actually. Yeah, the Mazarin Chest, I should say, after it had been conserved at the V&A, our Mazarin Chest, that is, the work finished in about 2008. We were able to send it to Japan.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I thought that it had, you know, after you conserved it. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I mean, we couldn't possibly have done that before. So, so we traveled to Japan. It then actually went to Los Angeles, where it was shown in the Getty Museum, and which is also where the Getty Foundation has its offices. So, I mean, that fitted in with the fact that they were, one of the 2 main funders of the conservation project. And then it came back to the V&A. And then we had, actually, funny enough, then there was a conference in 2009 around the whole subject. And we published, I suppose it was like the proceedings of the conference 2 years later, 2011. So there is that record, which was actually bilingual. If you open the book, it's all in English, but there's a CD, old technology, but the whole of all the text is translated in that. And so we've got that. So yes, I mean, that was, well, I can't say it myself, but I do think it's a kind of star project because it's started with one key object, but if it's kind of, expanded hugely.
Yeah, far more than I'm sure anyone could have ever imagined. I mean, these sort of projects do obviously expand beyond the object itself, but to that degree, across 3, 4, 5 countries, and the scholarly impact as well as the artistic, and of course the bilateral relations between Japan and the UK, are strengthened through things like this, and I think it's a real, prime example of how cultural institutions like the V&A and work of curators like yourself are the true cornerstone of these, these relations between nations. It's just
yeah, well, yes. I mean, actually, that's a great joy of being a curator, is that you are working with people who are sort of vocationally and in every other way committed to the kind of what it is that they're enthusiastic about and feel is important. And yeah, we've been able to, that it sort of brought all that together as well. And in fact, our connections with the Japanese world of urushi, makers and conservation, is still strong. And one of my two successors, who I think will continue. I mean, I think urushi work, the lacquer collection, is one of the things which she's going to be taking forward, I think, definitely. Yeah.
And just, coming back to something that was said earlier about, you could have just sent this object to Japan and had it restored. And, that would have been in many ways the easy thing to do. But if you just think of what would have been lost, and the fact that those skills now are with the V&A, and it is important to sort of, of course the expertise exists in Japan, but, considering that these objects, there are so many of them in the UK, it is in everyone's interest really for the conservation skills to be in both nations, so having a project like that really championed that, those ethics, like you were saying before, is just been fantastic, I think.
Yeah. Funnily enough, one of the things which is in the works but doesn't actually happen for another 3 years is we are setting up what's called a collection and CRC Collection Research Center, which is effectively, we're moving our large storage facility that's currently behind Olympia to the Olympic Park, where there's a large building that I think was during the Olympics, it was used as a communication center, I think. And it's, we're not the only tenants, I don't think, but we have a large section of this building, which is where we're going to have our main off-site storage. But it's going to be more, I think it's going to be, things will be stored there, but it will also be designed or it is designed in such a way that people have ready access to objects. And it can be used for teaching, researching, rather than, well, I mean, our store facilities are always open to research.
Storage, but I appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, we always, in providing access to stored objects is one of the things we do, but it makes that much easier, the way it's going to be set up. But anyway, what I was going to say is that one of the I mean, there will be conservation spaces within that. And one of the things we're going to do is actually have a room designed specifically for the conservation of urushi objects. Yeah. So so that, funny enough, that is happening.
It's just constantly developing stories. Yes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, Dr. Rupert Faulkner, thank you very much for joining me and talking with us about your astonishing career. And a huge congratulations from all of us on your award from the Japanese government as well.
Well, that's very kind. I mean, as I say, I'm deeply honored, and I never feel deserving of these things, but I'm very, very happy. Yes. Thank you.